conviction letter hit the table, history changed forever. What did she say? That changed everything. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was not prepared for her. At 9:01 a.m., as camera shutters clicked in their usual rhythm and aides passed whispering notes behind suited senators, a pair of dark stilettos stepped into the marble chamber. Slow, deliberate, uninvited. Jasmine Crockett didn't glance around. She didn't need to. Her tailored black suit cut through the formal air like a blade. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. She wasn't supposed to be here. This was a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, not a House floor battle. Yet there she was, walking past a stunned panel of lawmakers toward the witness table, her left hand gripping a manila folder so tightly the paper had creased at the corners. Eyes darted across the room, searching for answers. Why was a firebrand from the House Judiciary Committee now standing in a room meant to interrogate Supreme Court power? And why did she look like she wasn't here to ask for permission, but to deliver judgment? Amy Coney Barrett sat still, her expression composed, but her fingers tensing slightly over the water glass in front of her. She knew who Jasmine was. Everyone did. Crockett had made headlines in recent months for turning hearings into battlegrounds and for slicing through decorum when silence was used to shield the powerful. But today felt different. Jasmine didn't ease into pleasantries. She didn't smile. She waited for the chairman to acknowledge her presence. And when he didn't, she simply spoke. Her voice was low, precise, almost surgical. Before we proceed, I believe the committee and the American people have a right to view this. She placed the folder on the microphone like a detonator. Inside this file are sworn statements, sealed until this morning, implicating Justice Barrett in knowingly suppressing multiple reports of sexual abuse during her tenure as a senior figure in the People of Praise religious organization. Gas rippled like a seismic wave across the room. Barrett didn't blink, but her jaw shifted, barely. There was no gavel strike, no procedural rebuttal. Just a cold, terrifying silence. Jasmine opened the folder slowly, like peeling back the first layer of a wound the country never knew it carried. What you will see, she continued, her tone unwavering, is not an attack on religion. It is a reckoning with complicity. Behind her, screens flickered to life, showing the People of Praise logo beside blurred testimonies of women marked only as Victim A, Victim B, Victim C. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The facts were loud enough. In that moment, the hearing room was no longer a chamber of protocol. It had become a courtroom of national memory, and Jasmine Crockett had just stepped in as its conscience. And just as the murmurs began to rise, Jasmine leaned forward, her hand gliding over the folder like she was unlocking a vault that had been sealed for 2 decades. And what she pulled out would shift the nation's pulse. She didn't move fast. Every motion felt intentional, grounded, like she knew the moment wasn't just historic, it was sacred. From the folder, she drew out a page in a clear plastic sleeve, its edges slightly curled, its paper tinged with time. This document, Jasmine said, lifting it to eye level, was filed on May 12, 2004. It's a formal written complaint from a teenage girl. Her name is protected, but the initials remain. MT. She paused before continuing. She was 17 years old at the time, a member of the People of Praise. And in this complaint, she described being sexually abused by a senior male member of the group for over a year. The words hung in the air, heavier than any silence. Some senators shifted in their seats. Others froze completely. The audience behind the cameras leaned forward as if dragged closer by an invisible force. The girl didn't go to the police. She was told not to. She followed the chain of command in her religious community, just like she was taught. She spoke to her assigned spiritual leader. She trusted the process, believed it would protect her. But instead of an investigation, the complaint was forwarded quietly to the group's internal board. And right here, Jasmine held the document higher, is the stamp showing it was received. And below that, a signature, dated, initialed, approved for quiet resolution within the church. She turned her eyes to the panel. The signature belongs to Amy Coney Barrett. A low gasp rolled through the room, not loud but sharp, like air sucked through teeth. No one spoke. Even the clicking of pens stopped. Barrett remained motionless at her table, eyes fixed forward, jaw set. Jasmine continued, now placing a second sheet next to the first. This is the resolution summary. It's marked confidential, closed in prayer. According to this page, the group decided no law had been broken. The accused was not removed. The girl was not protected. She was told to pray, to fast, to forgive in silence. Her voice tightened, not in volume, but in weight. This is what it looks like when institutions choose image over accountability, when a child's pain is reduced to a spiritual exercise, and a system calls that justice. She closed the file without haste and looked to the committee. This wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice made with full awareness, one that protected the powerful and erased the powerless. The cameras didn't blink. Neither did most in the room. Something irreversible had just been said. And in that moment, the hearing was no longer about ethics. It was about truth that had waited too long to speak. Barrett sat completely still, her posture straight, hands folded neatly in front of her, like nothing had changed. But her eyes, those who watched closely could see it, had narrowed just slightly, a flicker, the kind of shift people trained for years to control. One of the senators, a longtime ally, cleared his throat softly, as if inviting her to respond. She did. Her voice was calm, composed, the cadence of a law professor giving a lecture, not a woman standing in the blast radius of a political detonation. I do not recall this specific situation, she said, and to my knowledge, I was never in a position to process or adjudicate formal complaints within the people of praise. The words came out clean, but not weightless. Something in the delivery was too rehearsed, too polished, like a statement crafted in anticipation of a moment she hoped would never come. Her gaze didn't meet Jasmine's. It hovered somewhere just beyond, like she was speaking to a room that didn't include the woman who had just named her. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She let the denial sit there, suspended in the air like a false note played in a cathedral. The senators watched, some with creased brows, others with hands clenched under the table. Everyone knew what had just happened. Barrett hadn't admitted guilt, but she hadn't denied knowledge either. She had slipped into the space between memory and accountability, a liminal zone that powerful people retreat to when the facts catch up too fast. And it was in that space, between I don't recall and I wasn't responsible, that the tension turned to steel. Not a single person reached for water. No aides whispered, no pens scratched paper. It was the kind of stillness that only comes when truth has been spoken and power refuses to acknowledge it. But silence, no matter how polished, can't erase history. And Jasmine hadn't come with words alone. She had come with memory recorded, frame by frame. But silence, no matter how polished, can't erase history. And Jasmine hadn't come with words alone. She had come with memory recorded, frame by frame. She reached for the remote without a word. No announcement, no build-up. Just a click. Quiet, almost insignificant. And then the screen behind the committee flared to life. The footage was grainy, the kind that trembles slightly as if the past itself is nervous to be seen. A simple church room came into focus. Beige walls, plastic chairs, a wooden lectern draped in white cloth. The year in the corner read 2006. At the podium stood a younger Coney Barrett. She was smiling, not the tight formal expression she wore in court, but something more relaxed. She looked comfortable, at home, surrounded by nodding faces. A small banner behind her read, Women of Guidance, Annual Commissioning Service. Jasmine didn't narrate. She didn't need to. The past was speaking for itself. Barrett's voice came through the speakers, clear, full of certainty. I'm honored to be chosen again this year to serve as a spiritual advisor, she said, folding her hands at the podium. Our young women need guidance. They trust us, and I will do everything I can to lead them away from sin, away from confusion, and toward a path of obedience and strength. The room in the video applauded, but inside the hearing chamber now, no one clapped. No one blinked. It was a moment suspended in ice. No drama, no confrontation. Just a simple recording, years old, suddenly dragging the present into question. The kind of evidence that couldn't be denied without denying one's own voice. Jasmine stood still as the video ended, letting the screen fade back to black. Then she looked up, not at Barrett, but at the committee. Her tone remained level. According to this committee record, Justice Barrett stated under oath that she had no role in handling complaints within People of Praise. But this footage, she gestured to the dim screen, shows her accepting a leadership role with moral authority over the very individuals who later came forward as victims. A few senators exchanged glances. One visibly lowered his pen. Another pressed his lips together and looked down. Jasmine's voice dropped slightly, not for drama, but for clarity. This is not about memory. This is about responsibility, because a woman cannot be both a trusted guide and a silent witness to harm. Not when those she guided ended up begging for help that never came. She held the remote in her hand again, but didn't move. She didn't need to. The damage wasn't in the footage itself. It was in the quiet that followed, the kind of quiet that makes truth feel heavier than accusation. Barrett remained still, composed, but her earlier words, "I don't recall," now hung in the air like a fragile mask held up to a growing storm. It hadn't cracked yet, but it was starting to bend. But in Washington, words and evidence are never enough, until real people step into the light, carrying the weight of what institutions tried to bury. They walked in without a word, moving slowly past the rows of press and policy staffers, each step more powerful than any opening statement. Three women, each in simple, unassuming clothing, each carrying a silence that had lasted far too long, took their seats behind Representative Jasmine Crockett. No security escort, no dramatic entrance, just presence. The kind of presence that makes a room recalibrate. For weeks, their identities had been protected. For years, their stories had been suppressed. And now, with legal protections secured by Crockett's office and trauma counselors standing by, they were here. Not to perform, not to accuse, but to exist in truth. Reporters craned their necks. Some staffers stopped taking notes. Even members of the committee glanced toward the women with an unease that couldn't be hidden. These weren't headlines. These were lives. They sat shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped tightly in their laps. No one looked at Barrett. They didn't have to. Their presence alone was an indictment more powerful than any soundbite. Crockett did not introduce them by name, only by intent. "These are three women," she said clearly, "whose testimonies have been vetted, protected, and feared." No one moved. The cameras zoomed in. Somewhere in the back, a senator exhaled, slow and strained. History wasn't just being discussed now. It was sitting in the room. The room had already gone still, but stillness became something else entirely when the voice's long silence began to speak. Not through lawyers or documents, but with trembling breath and undeniable truth. The first woman, introduced only as Sarah to protect her identity, stood behind the microphone with both hands gripping the edge of the wooden table. Her fingers were white at the knuckles, but her voice, though shaky, was clear enough to shatter the air. "I was 17 when it started," she began, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the committee. "He was a mentor, older, respected. I trusted him." A tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't stop. "When I told my spiritual leader what he was doing, what he had done, she listened. She nodded. And then she told me to pray, to fast, to search my heart for bitterness. That woman was Amy Barrett." The words landed not like an accusation, but like a confession the world had never made room to hear. For a moment it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. No one whispered. No one shifted. Even the senator who moments ago had seemed restless was now staring straight ahead, hands frozen mid-note. Sarah swallowed hard, then looked directly at the panel. "I didn't come here for revenge. I came because I was told to be silent for the sake of others. I was told that truth would bring shame, that truth would divide the community. That truth was selfish, and I believed them." For 20 years, her voice broke. "But today I believe something else. That truth can be an act of love, and that silence is not obedience, it's complicity." She stepped away from the microphone as Jasmine gently placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her without a word. The second woman, Leah, took her place. She didn't bring paper. She brought memory. Her voice was firmer, though the pain in her posture gave her away. I was the good one, she said bitterly. I never missed prayer. I never questioned leadership. I did everything right. Her eyes hardened. Until I confided in my advisor that one of the adult men in my cell group had cornered me, more than once after service. I told her it made me afraid to come back. Her response? She told me God sometimes tests women through male temptation, that I should dress more modestly, that I should thank God it wasn't worse. Her lip trembled, but she didn't stop. That advisor was Amy Barrett. A hush spread like fog. Barrett's expression didn't shift, but her stillness began to look less like composure and more like retreat. Leah glanced down at her hands, then back up. She didn't strike me. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just made sure no one else ever heard what I said. She made sure my pain stayed small and private so the community could remain whole and clean. A pause. But I wasn't whole, and I wasn't clean. I was ashamed, and she walked away like it never happened. The third woman, Rachel, was smaller in stature, her voice barely above a whisper, but every word came like a blade. I was 12, she said, and the room froze. He was my instructor in the youth program. He told me that God blesses obedience. He told me not to cry. She took a slow breath, then looked directly at the long table in front of her. When I turned 14, I told Amy Barrett, I thought she would save me. I thought she would be furious. But she didn't raise an alarm. She didn't call the police. She looked at me and said, don't destroy a man's future over confusion. Pray for clarity. Her voice cracked. So I did. For years, I prayed for clarity, and all it brought me was more silence. A single sob echoed from the gallery. No one turned to look. No one dared. Jasmine remained quiet throughout. She stood beside each woman, not as a politician, but as a witness. These weren't lines from a press release. They weren't political weapons. They were lived realities, bleeding, fragile, real. For a long moment after the last testimony, the room was silent, not empty, full of everything that had been hidden, delayed, denied. And that was when something shifted, visibly, irrevocably. This was no longer a hearing about ethics, no longer a debate over interpretation or policy or past decisions. This was truth, stripped of ceremony, and it stood taller than any title in the room. The testimonies had shaken the chamber, but Jasmine wasn't finished. There was still one story she had carried for years, one voice that couldn't speak today because it had been nearly destroyed trying. She took a step forward, not toward the microphone, but toward the weight of memory itself. Her voice, for the first time that morning, softened. Not in tone, but in reverence. 9 years ago, she began, long before I held office, I was visiting a psychiatric facility in Austin as part of a legal aid outreach program. Most patients there had no family, no visitors, no advocates. But one woman caught my attention. She had no name listed, just initials. She was withdrawn, barely responsive, until I mentioned the people of praise. Jasmine paused, letting the name settle like dust on polished marble. That's when her eyes changed. That's when she started to speak. Jasmine placed a single sheet of handwritten notes on the table. Not a legal brief, but a personal memory etched in ink. Her name was withheld for privacy, but she was once known in her community as a promising Bible student. And the person who led that Bible study? Jasmine turned toward the committee. Amy Coney Barrett. A ripple passed through the room. No gasp this time, just a cold realization returning. The woman told me something I've never forgotten, Jasmine continued. She said, I still hear her voice in my head, not yelling, just calm, over and over, saying, don't destroy the community's name. Don't shame the body of Christ. Be still, be silent, be good. Jasmine looked up. That voice never left her, not in her dorm, not during the diagnosis, not in the years she stopped speaking entirely. There was no need for a recording, no need for cross-examination. This wasn't evidence in the legal sense. It was worse. It was the legacy of silence sharpened into command. This woman didn't end up in that hospital because of one man's violence, Jasmine said. She ended up there because the very structure she trusted convinced her that her pain was the real sin, that speaking it aloud was betrayal. She stepped back slightly, letting the moment breathe, then filled it with words that would not go unnoticed. This is no longer about one person's failure. It's about a system that made silence a sacrament. The senators sat frozen, caught in a space where decorum no longer mattered. One aide in the back turned off his screen. Another gently closed a folder, like the sound of paper would be too much. Jasmine leaned into the microphone, her final words not shouted but delivered like a sentence passed down from something older than law. When justice turns its back on the vulnerable, it stops being justice. It becomes something else, something hollow, something dangerous, something that wears the name of righteousness to avoid its responsibility. She let the words echo, then returned to her seat, not triumphant, not satisfied, just quiet, because some moments are too sacred for applause, and some truths once spoken do not need to be raised. They simply settle into the air and never leave. The silence still lingered from Jasmine's final words, but it was about to be broken, not by opinion or argument, but by the voice of someone who once stood at the center of the system itself. Without warning, the chamber screen came to life again, this time with a different kind of footage. It wasn't grainy, it wasn't secret. It was filmed just a week prior in a plain, sterile office, with a white backdrop and a timestamp confirming its authenticity. On the screen sat a man in his 60s, hands folded in his lap, eyes steady beneath wire-rimmed glasses. His name appeared at the bottom: Matthew R. Keller, former National Elder, People of Praise, 1998 to 2012. His voice, when it came, was measured, with the controlled cadence of someone who had kept too much for too long. My name is Matthew Keller. I served as an elder and board member for the People of Praise for over 14 years. And yes, I worked directly with Amy Barrett during her years as a women's ministry leader and internal adjudicator. A visible stir rippled through the room. Some senators leaned in, others stiffened. Keller continued. During my tenure, our council handled dozens of internal complaints, most of them related to inappropriate behavior or abuse by community leaders. He paused. In our model, justice wasn't measured in facts, but in faith. We were taught to search not for evidence, but for spiritual clarity. And when clarity wasn't strong enough, we dismissed the case. The camera tightened slightly on his face. Amy Barrett was present in those meetings. She voted on outcomes. In at least 3 cases I can confirm, she voted against escalation, stating the accusations did not carry, in her words, sufficient spiritual weight. A low hum began to build in the room, people shifting, reacting, whispering names under breath. But the video wasn't done. Keller adjusted slightly in his chair, his voice tightening. I carry guilt for my part, but I'm here today because what was once hidden under the language of grace must now be confronted with the language of law. We weren't protecting victims. We were protecting the institution, and that includes her. He reached down, pulling from a folder and holding up a single sheet to the camera. This is a document distributed internally, defining our response strategy when abuse complaints risked public attention. It reads, "We do not let the media dictate the boundaries of God's mercy." Gasps burst across the chamber like controlled detonations. The quote appeared on the screen in bold black font, its weight sinking into the air like iron. Cameras zoomed in. Committee aides scrambled for paper. Jasmine didn't move. She simply folded her hands in front of her and let the truth do what it was always meant to do: resonate. The room split almost instantly. On one side, a cluster of lawmakers broke into stunned applause. Not celebration, but the kind of reflexive gesture people make when reality overwhelms protocol. On the other side, silence. Jawlines clenched, hands frozen. A few senators stared at the floor, avoiding the screen entirely. And at the center of it all sat Justice Amy Coney Barrett, no longer calm, no longer composed. Her face, always pale under the lights, had turned a shade closer to paper. Not from rage, not from fear, but from the slow realization that the structure built around her title was beginning to buckle. The video faded, but the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt like judgment had already arrived, and this time, it hadn't waited for the gavel. The hearing chamber had gone quiet, but the outside world had just begun to scream, and what started as testimony now surged into a national reckoning that no institution, no matter how sacred, could outrun. By nightfall, two words had detonated across social media like a tidal wave. Barrett knew and silenced his complicity. They didn't need context, just names, fragments, emotions. Millions reposted the clip of Jasmine Crockett standing beside the three survivors, her face unreadable but unyielding, as the testimony echoed through halls of power and onto phones, feeds, and newsrooms. Within 12 hours, Wash Barrett knew was trending in 48 states. By morning, it was etched onto cardboard signs, digital billboards, and the Sharpie-scrawled backs of denim jackets. The hashtags weren't political anymore. They were personal. They were not just about Amy Coney Barrett. They were about every institution that told women, be quiet, be kind, be grateful it wasn't worse. At the University of Notre Dame, Barrett's alma mater, the air thickened with protest. Hundreds of students lined the central quad, holding candles and printouts of the internal memo shown in the Senate hearing. "We do not let the media dictate the boundaries of God's mercy," was projected onto the side of the chapel in 10-foot-tall letters, a silent act of rebellion that lit up the stone walls with uncomfortable truth. Law students, many of them previously hesitant to criticize a sitting justice, now formed a circle around the building that bore Barrett's name. They linked arms, some chanted, others wept. All stood still when a survivor's words, "She told me to pray the pain away," played through a loudspeaker on loop. In classrooms, professors debated the legal implications. But on the quad, no one was debating anymore. They were remembering. Across the country, the fracture lines deepened. Conservative women's organizations, many of which had long embraced Barrett as a symbol of moral clarity and maternal strength, began to splinter in full view of the public. Some doubled down, calling the hearing a coordinated smear campaign and accusing Jasmine of exploiting trauma for political gain. But others, more quietly, more painfully, broke ranks. Former supporters posted open letters confessing their own experiences with spiritual dismissal. One viral post read, "I defended her because I thought she was like me. Turns out she was who silenced me." Church communities debated doctrine on Facebook forums. Sunday school teachers wept into live streams. Lines once drawn by faith now blurred under the weight of consequence. Then came the exodus from silence. Former members of the People of Praise, some now middle-aged, some barely out of college, began stepping forward. Not all had stories of abuse. Some had just seen how it worked. One by one, they posted testimonials under the tag "I was there," describing closed-door meetings, warnings against worldly lawsuits, and instructions to handle discipline internally, with compassion and without noise. One man recalled being told to erase a written report from a teenage girl because it brought spiritual doubt to the community. Another posted a photo of the same basement used for reconciliation counseling, where his sister had been told she misinterpreted attention as harm. The details varied. The pattern did not. News outlets scrambled to catch up. Editorials flooded in, from both left and right. The Washington Post ran the headline, "Justice in Question When Silence Becomes Doctrine." The Wall Street Journal countered with, "Barrett under siege, faith, power, and the politics of pain." But the truth was no longer in the hands of commentators. It had spilled into public ownership. Every interview, every tweet, every tear became part of a mosaic that no spin room could disassemble. Even late-night television, normally allergic to religious scandal, couldn't ignore the footage. Comedians paused their jokes to play clips from the hearing, then went silent. Sometimes silence says more. Barrett's image, once painted in soft light, surrounded by children in scripture, began to shift in the public eye. The framed photos of her swearing in, the glowing portraits in profile, the covers showing her holding a Bible beside her family, all began to feel like relics from another world. Not false, but incomplete. Now side by side with those images stood photos of survivors, faces blurred for privacy, eyes wide with exhaustion. And then, a new portrait, Barrett in still frame. During the moment Jasmine unveiled the 2006 video, her lips pressed tight, the corners of her eyes drawn downward. Not by anger, but by gravity. That single frame flooded timelines, captioned only with, "She knew." This was no longer about one woman or one case. It was about what America was willing to see once it could no longer look away. Jasmine had not destroyed Barrett's legacy. She had revealed what was already written beneath it, layered in obedience, protected by reverence, but undeniably real. The question hanging in the air now wasn't whether Barrett would respond. It was whether a country that had idolized silence would finally choose to listen. By the time the final day of the hearing arrived, the nation was no longer asking what Amy Coney Barrett had done. They were asking whether she had any moral ground left to stand on. And Jasmine Crockett walked into that chamber, knowing the answer demanded more than evidence. It demanded a reckoning. The chamber was packed tighter than it had been all week. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were waiting for something unspoken, something final. Cameramen checked their focus twice. Journalists held their breath before typing. Even the air conditioning seemed to hum lower, as if the room itself had developed a pulse. Jasmine Crockett sat still as the chairman gavelled the hearing to order, her hands empty, no folder in sight. The legal briefs, the affidavits, the memos, they were all gone. What she had left couldn't be cited or cross-examined. It was weight, and it was time. She rose slowly from her seat, the legs of her chair scraping softly against the floor. A sound that, in that moment, felt louder than any gavel. She didn't touch the microphone. She didn't need to. The entire room was already leaning toward her. Even the senators who had challenged her earlier now sat stiff and silent, eyes fixed forward. Jasmine took a step toward the witness table, toward Barrett, and stopped just close enough to stand in her shadow without flinching. "There comes a point," she began, voice low and calm, "when the question is no longer what happened, but what we're willing to accept." She glanced around the chamber, not to perform, but to hold them all in the moment. "Justice Barrett, you may never face criminal charges. You may never spend a single hour answering to a court of law. But that doesn't mean you're innocent, and it certainly doesn't mean you're worthy of the bench you sit on." A few gasps, quickly stifled. One senator reached for his water and missed. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She simply walked forward, one measured step, and placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of Barrett. A resignation letter, undated, unsigned, but complete in every other way. "This is not a demand," she said quietly. "It's a choice, a chance." Her eyes didn't blink. "Not because I want you erased, but because the people in this country, especially those who've been told their pain is too inconvenient, too disruptive, too emotional, deserve to see what it looks like when accountability finally speaks louder than reputation." The paper didn't move. Barrett stared at it, jaw clenched, lips pressed into a pale line. Her hands remained in her lap, but her fingers twitched once, subtle, barely noticeable. But it was there. For the first time all week, the justice looked like she didn't know what to do next. Jasmine stepped back, not as retreat, but to let the moment land. "You don't owe me an answer," she added, "but you owe something to the women who begged for help, to the girl who prayed her suffering would matter, to the woman in the hospital who hears your voice more than her own." She let the silence answer for her, and the silence was deafening. The cameras didn't pan away. They locked in. On Barrett's face, on the letter, on the expression that hovered between disbelief and recognition. It wasn't shame. It was the dawning realization that no legal robe, no polished statement, no legacy carefully constructed in headlines and handshakes could protect her from the truth once it had been spoken aloud and believed. One senator coughed into his sleeve. Another looked down, unable to meet the eyes of the witnesses seated just feet away. And still, the camera kept rolling. It captured every breath, every blink, every tiny shift of posture. Because this wasn't just a hearing anymore. This was history being carved, not in stone, but in the quiet collapse of a narrative too long protected. Then Jasmine turned, not toward Barrett, but toward the dais. "I have no further questions," she said. Her voice carried like a verdict, not shouted, delivered. A closing statement not just for the committee, but for the country. As she returned to her seat, not a single person spoke, not even the chairman. For one elongated breath, the entire hearing room existed in suspension, between silence and consequence, between what had been tolerated and what could no longer be. And the cameras, and they didn't flinch. They captured it all. Every flicker in Barrett's eyes, every stunned expression across the panel, every ripple in the gallery where survivors sat upright, unblinking, like they were watching something sacred unfold. And perhaps they were. The cameras eventually stopped rolling, but the silence they left behind carried a weight louder than applause. And 3 days later, that silence would explode into something Washington had never seen before. It began with a one-paragraph press release, simple, clinical, stripped of all emotion. Justice Amy Coney Barrett will temporarily step away from her official duties, citing an overwhelming media environment and a desire not to distract from the work of the court. No apology, no acknowledgement, just 12 carefully chosen lines, signed with her initials and the seal of the Supreme Court. But the world knew better. This wasn't a sabbatical, it was a retreat under fire. Within minutes, the statement was everywhere. Screens lit up across newsrooms, phones buzzed across campuses, and networks cut into live programming to announce what one anchor called a tremor through the pillars of American justice. But the tremor was just the beginning. Within hours, the Federal Judicial Ethics Committee, a body rarely mentioned in headlines and even more rarely invoked, released its own statement. Unlike Barrett's, theirs was not brief, it was bold. It confirmed that the committee had voted unanimously to open a formal inquiry into allegations brought forward during the Senate hearing, including, but not limited to, abuse suppression, willful neglect of internal reports, and potential breaches of judicial disclosure. For the first time in modern history, a sitting Supreme Court justice was now the subject of an active ethics investigation by her own branch. The news hit the Capitol like a second detonation. On the Hill, senators who had once defended Barrett grew strangely silent. Some claimed surprise. Others refused to comment. But in private corridors and behind polished doors, there was only one phrase being whispered again and again. She crossed a line too deep to ignore. Even conservative think tanks, those that had celebrated her rise as a moral triumph, began pulling her portraits from their walls, quietly distancing themselves from a legacy now laced with complicity. Outside the court, the response was seismic. Protesters returned to the marble steps, this time with posters reading, "Resignation is not redemption, and justice can't be selective." Law students in Chicago, Boston, and Atlanta walked out of lectures in silent solidarity. And in Washington, staffers from multiple branches leaked internal memos detailing the court's response. Emergency meetings, press protocols, and, most damning of all, the revelation that two justices had privately urged Barrett to consider a graceful exit to preserve the court's integrity. Internationally, the headlines were unrelenting. Le Monde ran, "The sainted judge falls." The Guardian declared, "From icon to inquiry, Barrett faces backlash at home." Even the Vatican Observer, normally reserved in secular affairs, published a column questioning the ethics of shielding sin behind sanctity. One quote echoed across languages. "A woman once hailed as the conscience of the court now stands accused of silencing the conscience of others." And while Barrett said nothing, her absence spoke volumes. Her chambers remained dark. Her clerks, once fiery in defense, now deflected inquiries with clipped responses and redirected emails. Inside the court, tensions festered. The Chief Justice, reportedly blindsided by the scale of the backlash, held a closed-door meeting described by one source as an internal earthquake. Trust had fractured, not because of political disagreement, but because a foundational question now hung over the court like a storm cloud. If moral authority fails at the highest level, who judges the judges? Historians rushed to their archives. There were scandals before, conflicts of interest, financial missteps, personal indiscretions, but none like this. Never before had a justice been accused not just of failing the law, but of betraying its very purpose. Never before had a cultural icon, praised for her piety, her motherhood, her intellect, been revealed as a gatekeeper in a system built to mute the voices of the wounded. For generations, the robes were seen as armor. Now they were being seen as masks. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She gave no interviews. She posted no tweets. She let the evidence breathe. Because some truths don't need echo chambers. They only need daylight. The headlines raged, the court reeled, and the public demanded more. But Jasmine Crockett remained still, as if she knew the final blow didn't need to be shouted. It only needed to be clear. She broke her silence not in a press conference, not with a speech beneath the Capitol dome, but with a single tweet. 8 words that cracked across the national conversation like thunder. No one is too powerful to be forgiven without apology. There was no hashtag, no tagging of names, just truth, distilled to its most brutal form. And within minutes, it was everywhere. Journalists dissected its tone. Commentators tried to reframe it. But the public already understood. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a demand. It was a line drawn, not in anger, but in principle. It was Jasmine's final word. And it hit harder than any ruling. The ripple was immediate. Across the country, lawmakers, emboldened by weeks of public outrage and survivor testimony, began drafting what would become the most significant judicial reform bill in modern U.S. history. Behind closed doors, Democrats called it long overdue. Republicans called it damage control, but none dared oppose it on the record. The people had seen too much, heard too much, felt too much. And what once seemed impossible, a bipartisan move to regulate transparency at the highest level of American law, now moved with unstoppable force. 30 days after Barrett's resignation, the Judicial Transparency and Integrity Act of 2025, unofficially dubbed the Barrett Disclosure Law, passed the House in a landslide. Days later, the Senate followed. The law required all current and future federal judges to publicly disclose affiliations with religious or ideological organizations, particularly those that practiced internal adjudication or held disciplinary authority over members. It also required the creation of a judicial ethics archive, a searchable database where the public could track previous complaints, affiliations, recusals, and advisory roles. The bill's language was cold, clinical, but its impact was electric. For the first time, robes no longer guaranteed secrecy. Faith was no longer a shield. The law didn't attack religion. It forced accountability where blind reverence had long reigned. And in courtrooms from Boston to Boise, clerks and justices alike began reviewing their own histories with new urgency. Some did so quietly. Others resigned in advance, not because they were guilty, but because they knew the era of sacred insulation had ended. A new standard had been born, and its architect never raised her voice to build it. But the aftershocks didn't stop at the judiciary. In churches, debates ignited over doctrine and duty. In law schools, ethics courses rewrote their syllabi overnight. Students once trained to see judges as untouchable now studied Crockett's hearing like scripture. Professors used the video not for politics, but for principle. This is what happens, one instructor said, when the system forgets who it's supposed to protect. Cable news panels that once mocked Jasmine's confrontational style now ran retrospectives titled The Crockett Standard. Late-night hosts replayed the moment she slid the unsigned resignation letter across the table, like a weapon forged from restraint. Even comedians stopped making jokes, because some moments don't belong to commentary, they belong to consequence. Outside Washington, survivors who had never spoken before began organizing, not with rage, but with strategy. They started nonprofits, filed lawsuits, launched podcasts, not to relive the pain, but to retell it, with power. The term spiritual obstruction entered legal vernacular, and slowly, painfully, the word accountability stopped being a punchline. It became policy. Jasmine Crockett never claimed a victory tour. She didn't seek interviews. When asked to speak at Harvard, Yale, and Georgetown, she declined, sending only one quote in reply. Justice isn't what we say in courtrooms. It's what we allow behind closed doors. And so the nation changed, not because one woman tore down an empire, but because she refused to be silent in front of it. And in that refusal, others found their voice. They watched it unfold, not from the front row, but from chambers thick with velvet drapes and law books that hadn't been cracked in years. They watched from behind the sealed doors of judicial dignity. They watched with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from fear wrapped in tradition. These judges, federal, appellate, lifetime appointed guardians of the law, were not the ones being questioned. Their names weren't called. Their faces weren't splashed across breaking news tickers. But they saw it. They saw Jasmine Crockett stand in that hearing, flanked by survivors. They saw her deliver truth not with fire, but with force. And in the way Barrett's hands trembled when the resignation letter landed on the table, they saw something else: themselves. The walls of the judiciary are built thick for a reason, not just to preserve quiet, but to absorb responsibility. And for decades, they had done exactly that. Complaints had been whispered, buried, reframed as misunderstandings. Investigations were internal. Silence was wisdom. Reticence was decorum. But after that hearing, something shifted. The silence that once protected had begun to accuse. In circuit courts across the country, the tremor was subtle, but real. A retired magistrate in Kansas quietly shredded his old file notes. A senior judge in Maryland, once celebrated for his mentorship, asked his clerk to retrieve a letter from 2009, one he hadn't looked at in 14 years. In Alabama, a judicial assistant found herself staring at a drawer full of sealed envelopes, her hand hovering, unsure whether to open the past or close it tighter. There were no alarms, no raids, no subpoenas, only the new presence of dread, public memory, because now America was watching. Bar associations began to stir. Ethics professors were invited to review internal codes. Clerks, once trained to follow the judge's lead, began to talk among themselves. In one East Coast district, a coalition of former law clerks sent a joint letter to the chief judge requesting a full audit of uninvestigated sexual misconduct reports over the last 20 years. In another, a whistleblower leaked an internal email from 2013 titled, "Handling Unverified Accusations from Religious Circles," a phrase that no longer felt bureaucratic, but explosive. And still, the older judges sat in their wood-paneled chambers, staring at the walls that had once protected them, now realizing they were made of glass. Some responded swiftly. They issued retirement letters, citing family health issues. Others published op-eds preemptively defending their careers. One federal judge in Texas went on a conservative talk show and claimed that activists are trying to turn the judiciary into a confession booth. But even his voice faltered when the host played footage from the Crockett hearing, because facts, once spoken plainly, don't die in rebuttal. They linger. They rot beneath every polite denial. The judicial conference convened an emergency session. The agenda was no longer just caseload reform or funding structures. It was existential. The chief judge of the Ninth Circuit began the meeting with a single sentence: "The days of pretending that ethics don't apply to us are over." No one laughed. No one pushed back. Not even the most conservative bench in the room. The conference passed a resolution within hours, a review of all internally dismissed judicial conduct complaints from the last 15 years. It wasn't complete justice, but it was a breach in the wall. And for a body that hadn't changed its code of conduct in decades, it was a landslide. Inside these hallowed institutions, the shift wasn't declared, it was felt. It looked like a judge staring at an old photograph of a youth group and realizing one of those smiling faces was the girl who filed a complaint he dismissed. It looked like a law clerk deleting a congratulatory email they once sent to Barrett. It looked like silence, not serene anymore, but broken, bitter, belated. And beneath it all was fear. Not the fear of being caught, but the fear of being remembered for having done nothing. Jasmine Crockett never named them. She didn't have to. Her voice didn't need to reach every judge. The truth had already entered the bloodstream of the system. It was in the court elevators, in the whispered lunches, in the way clerks hesitated before forwarding a file. It was in the mirrors of those who once believed their robes made them invisible. And the most terrifying part? It wasn't over. Because Jasmine had not just exposed a woman, she had exposed a mechanism, one that stretched across pews, chambers, and decades of polite disinterest. The reckoning wasn't just about Barrett's silence. It was about everyone who had practiced the same silence. perfected it, taught it. And now they all sat waiting, wondering if someone else had kept the file, remembered the quote, written down the name. Some began to confess quietly, to staff, to mentors, to no one in particular. Others kept their heads down, praying the wave would break before it reached their shore. But they all heard the same low hum in their bones. Justice was awake, and it was looking directly at them. The hearings ended. The headlines thinned. The cameras packed up. Washington returned to its mechanical heartbeat of lobbyists and late votes. But something deeper, quieter, more permanent had shifted. This time it didn't fade with the news cycle. This time the wound stayed open. Jasmine Crockett never claimed credit. She returned to her office like nothing had happened, gave no interviews, avoided the spotlight. But across the country, people remembered everything. Not just her final words, not just the resignation letter, but what it had taken to reach that moment. Survivors remembered. Law students remembered. Pastors remembered. Voters remembered. And most importantly, those who had once stayed silent now began to speak. Churches that had never acknowledged their complicity in abuse began issuing public statements, not just of regret, but of self-examination. Sermons once used to bury the truth now became confessions, admissions that doctrine had been used not as guidance, but as a gag. In one Missouri church, a woman stood up mid-service and said, "My sister left this congregation because we called her a liar. I'm here to say she was right, and we were wrong." The pastor said nothing, but the room applauded. At universities, the shift was sharper. Notre Dame, Barrett's alma mater, was forced to revise its curriculum. Professors who once used her judicial philosophy as a model now taught her case as a study in ethical collapse. Guest speakers read survivor testimony aloud in lecture halls. Students formed forums, published papers, and launched a campaign called #JusticeBeyondTheRobes, demanding transparency not just in courts, but in every institution that claims moral authority. The phrase began appearing on campus walls, etched into bathroom mirrors and dorm room doors. Truth delayed is pain extended. In the legal world, something even more dramatic unfolded. Young lawyers began refusing clerkships under judges with questionable past. They organized networks to vet judicial records, not just for legal brilliance, but for ethical patterns. Bar associations held emergency conferences. Ethics boards received a tidal wave of complaints once shelved for lack of corroboration. Retired justices who had long escaped scrutiny found their names resurfacing in whispered conversations in online archives. The old rule, "Don't rock the bench," was being rewritten from below. And Jasmine? She remained still, but her stillness was not retreat. It was authority, the kind earned not through office, but through clarity in the fire. In the months that followed, survivors of spiritual abuse began organizing nationally. Some formed survivor-led truth commissions, others filed lawsuits, but many, thousands, simply began to tell their stories. Not for likes, not for sympathy, but because someone had finally made space for the truth to land. A woman in Georgia, once told to keep her suffering private to preserve God's work, posted a photo of herself holding a sign. "He wasn't God. He was just a man in a robe. And now I'm not afraid of either." The image went viral. High school students began citing the Crockett hearing in debate competitions. TikTok creators stitched together moments from the hearing with clips of historical protests, calling it the moment accountability came back to Washington. One short, soundtracked with slow strings and a black screen showing only Jasmine's quote, "No one is too powerful to be forgiven without apology," was viewed 12 million times in 3 days. Even the White House could not ignore it. In a rare bipartisan effort, the president convened a task force on institutional ethics and accountability, bringing together judges, scholars, clergy, and survivors. Jasmine declined to participate. When asked why, her office responded with a one-line statement. "The people who already spoke paid the highest price. Let their voices lead." And they did. The first reform proposed wasn't legal. It was cultural. Every federal agency, including the Department of Justice and the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, was directed to audit internal misconduct processes, identify religiously shielded adjudication mechanisms, and release a public report on their impact. What had once been considered private pastoral matters were now subjects of national scrutiny. The line between spiritual guidance and institutional protection had blurred, and now it was being drawn in ink. By the one-year anniversary of the hearing, more than 40 members of Congress had co-sponsored a bill expanding the Barrett disclosure law. The amendment added a clause requiring mandatory recusal in any case involving organizations a judge had belonged to within the last 10 years. It also created a new category of judicial ethics violations. Moral concealment. Some called it too broad. Others called it revolutionary. The people called it necessary. Meanwhile, those once loyal to Barrett wrestled with the dissonance. Some still defended her. Others went silent. But in private Facebook groups, behind gated newsletters, a different kind of conversation began. What do we do when the person we trusted becomes the reason someone never spoke again? These weren't accusations. They were awakenings. In one closed group for women's Bible study leaders, an anonymous moderator posted, "If any of us ever told someone to stay quiet, we owe them more than prayer. We owe them a reckoning." Hundreds responded. Some left ministry. Some called old friends and apologized. Others simply sat with the truth for the first time, no longer weaponized by politics or filtered through religion, but felt fully and without escape. And that was the point, because Jasmine hadn't just changed policy, she had changed memory. The hearings weren't just about Barrett's choices, they were about how many people it takes to keep a wound from healing, and how many more it takes to open it properly. In that sense, the victory wasn't hers. It belonged to every woman who sat at a table and wasn't believed, to every man who reported something and was told to pray instead of act, to every teenager who thought silence was faith, to every parent who wondered if asking too many questions would cost them their community. They were the legacy, and America, for once, refused to look away. The hearings had ended, laws were rewritten, and institutions trembled. But beyond the headlines and history books, there remained something deeper, a human lesson carved in silence, defiance, and the unbearable cost of looking away. Justice at its core is not a ceremony. It is not robes or gavels or marble steps. Justice is a mirror, one that asks not how much power a person holds, but how much truth they are willing to carry. Jasmine Crockett reminded America of that truth, not with fury, but with discipline. She didn't scream. She didn't perform. She stood in front of an institution built to ignore voices like hers and spoke anyway. That act alone was radical, not because she was louder than the system, but because she was braver than its design. In a world that rewards silence with advancement, she chose confrontation. And in that choice, she exposed the cost of every quiet moment that had protected power instead of people. The lesson was never just about Barrett. It was about what happens when dignity becomes a disguise and when mercy is used as a muzzle. For decades, institutions across America hid behind civility. They called silence wisdom. They called discretion godliness. They weaponized grace not as a tool of compassion, but as a shield to deflect accountability. And people, especially women, were told that forgiveness meant forgetting, that righteousness meant compliance, that pain should be swallowed for the greater good. Jasmine's stand shattered that illusion. Her hearing became a battlefield not just for one name, but for every unseen story, every folded letter, every voice that had once asked for help and been told to pray instead of speak. The message was clear. When systems are built to protect the reputation of the powerful over the safety of the vulnerable, they are not systems of justice. They are systems of survival for the wrong side. And in the wake of her stand, a question remained. One every viewer, every citizen had to face alone. Where have I been silent? Because Jasmine's battle didn't belong only to courtrooms or Congress. It belonged to workplaces where misconduct is handled quietly, to churches where victims are forgiven while abusers are promoted, to schools where whispered warnings are buried in bureaucratic language. It belonged to dinner tables where survivors are told, "Don't make it awkward," and to group chats where justice is debated like it's theory, not someone's bleeding truth. The lesson wasn't theoretical, it was lived. and it asked for courage far beyond a hearing room. What Jasmine proved is that change doesn't start when the powerful step down. It starts when someone with no reason to keep going, keeps going anyway. Not because they're certain they'll win, but because they refuse to let silence be the last word. Her moral clarity wasn't born in politics. It was born in witnessing too many people suffer quietly, in a psychiatric ward, in a sealed file, in a basement church room where reconciliation meant erasure. She remembered every detail, every voice, every look. And when the time came, she didn't speak for them. She made space for them to speak themselves. That is the true face of justice. Not performance, but permission. The human lesson lives there, in the tension between what we tolerate and what we believe in. Too often, injustice hides behind familiarity. It wears the face of a beloved pastor, a respected judge, a decorated public servant. But Jasmine showed us that trust without scrutiny is a trap, and silence, no matter how holy it sounds, can be a form of violence. Her final words, "No one is too powerful to be forgiven without apology," didn't just convict a judge. They redefined how a country sees its heroes, not by what they achieve, but by what they refuse to confront. In that light, justice became something more than law. It became a conscience, shared, unflinching, and finally awake. And perhaps the most painful part of her lesson, the part that made the entire country shift in its seat, was this. It shouldn't have taken Jasmine. The evidence had been there. The stories had been told. The whispers were known. But no one wanted to move until one woman forced them to. That discomfort isn't a flaw in the system. It is the system. And unless we name it, unless we look at it without flinching, we are part of the silence that sustained it. So what do we do now? That's the final question Jasmine left burning in the air. We audit our memory. We revisit the moment we said nothing. We reread the email we ignored. We ask who sat in our classrooms, our offices, our pews, screaming in silence while we called ourselves neutral. And we understand that neutrality in the face of pain is not wisdom. It is surrender. Justice doesn't come wrapped in clarity. It arrives in fragments, stammered testimony, long pauses, trembling hands. And if we only accept it when it's tidy, we were never interested in truth to begin with. Jasmine didn't teach the country how to fight. She taught it how to listen, endure, and not blink when the truth demands more than we're ready to give. And that will outlast the hearings. That will survive the news cycle. Because what she did can't be undone. Not by the next judge, not by the next scandal, not by the next silence. It lives in us now, and it's ours to carry or to ignore again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.